Philosopher Stoner 666 here. As you can see, I'm at work. So a weird topic's been on my brain for a little bit. I encountered this dating coach online, his Facebook group, David Tian, T-A-I-N, PhD. Supposedly PhD. He doesn't seem that smart to me, but an interesting meme and statistic and research study that he posted to his group was about how apparently 50% of male genetics throughout history have not reproduced. So the bottom 50% of men never pass on their genes. Now, what I thought was interesting is that this sort of ties into another book that I read way back about 10 years ago called Adam's Curse by a guy called Brian Sykes, S-Y-K-E-S. Now in Adam's Curse, he sort of goes on about how the Y chromosome is diminishing, it's weakening, and he postulates that a projection that perhaps 500 or 1,000 years from now or longer, on a time scale that we can't really be too concerned with, it's all strictly hypothetical, that the Y chromosome's going extinct, that there won't be men in the future, a future without men, is what he talks about. We'll go to some sort of asexual reproduction where it's like we're like going to be like cells almost, the way bacteria reproduce. Now I think this ties in quite nicely with this David Tian's guy thing about the bottom 50% of men don't reproduce. So it's interesting from an anti-natalist perspective when we can look at the early history of anti-natalism is mainly religious. So you have early Buddhism and early Christianity were quite anti-natal. It was the ascetic path, right? So monasticism and celibacy. St. Paul, one of the apostles, went on about the virtues of celibacy. So obviously they were not interested in reproduction. They saw that sex and the whole reproduction and whole birth thing, they were more onto that notion that the problem was really birth. But of course in their era, they had no birth control, no scientific understanding, and no nuclear weapons. So there was not a lot they could do about the problem. But if this is true, 50% of male genetics are just crap, garbage. They're not attractive to women, and men are innately disposable. And you can see that in my video I did before a few weeks ago, the beta male problem. I already sort of delved into this topic about there's, Vox Day's hierarchy of males with, alpha sort of at the top. And then you go all the way, you got your betas, your deltas, your gammas, and you got the omega male. You do have your sigma male that's sort of like a competitor to the alpha, but he's kind of a loner, all that. And they all have their pros and cons. But yeah, ultimately 50% of male genetics are right from getting out of the gate are thrown in the trash. And this guy, of course, highly invested in the Life Project, this David Tian guy, saying how, you got to work on your dating skills and self-improvement to not wind up in the bottom 50% because we got to follow the life script, trademark symbol, the human project script where you go on the date and you buy dinner and you buy the woman the diamond ring and you have kids and you live happily ever after, and that's all just so marvelous, right? When it's, to me, just this statistic tying it in with all the other evidence just shows, well, what a fucking monstrously, preposterously grotesque, idiotic, insane game that 50% of the genes just get thrown in the trash can. Male genetics. Now, it's also interesting because I did an ancestry DNA test, and I can see evidence to support this just in this personal test that I did, that the DNA test shows my grandmothers on both sides. It shows their genetic profile more than the male profile, so it's 50% from France, and then a little bit from England and Wales, and then a little bit from Scandinavia, where my mother was claimed to be more of Italian ancestry, and she looked a lot different from me. She had dark eyes, dark features. In fact, all that on my mother's side of the family, they were all like that, darker features, Italian. My grandfather was from Calabria, supposedly. That none of his male genetics show up in my genetic profile. So clearly, yes, the male genes are more predominantly, and he gets into it in the Adam's Curse book, Brian Sykes, that they're innately recessive. But I mean, again, not again, but You can see, though, that men are causing most of the problems in the world. And why? It's because of our disposability. So we're competing in this toxic environment that we've created. Again, it's all the men's fault. It's not the feminists. It's not the women. It's just a lack of social engineering and a lack of a script. But we're competing in this toxic environment to get access to the best mates possible. Right, so we can see with some of the school shootings that have happened recently that most of them, you get outside the gun debate and you get outside the psychotropic debate, which are valid debates. I'm not going to get into that here. But that, yeah, there was like lovers quarrel stuff. Like they tried to hook up with some woman on a date or something and they got rejected. They were peer rejected, had no friends, socially rejected completely, and they decided to take revenge. That, you had for centuries this script to keep this disposability in check. You had religious institutions, like I talked about, that forced men, predominantly men, in certain cases women, like with nunneries, and those would be women that were infertile, by the way, typically, that nowadays get IVF. But yeah, that they would sort of compel these disposable men into religious institutions. And then for the lesser betas, you had arranged marriages and stuff, coalitions of beta males throughout history arranging these systems so that they'd get laid, at least somewhat. And typically what happens, though, because we come from primitive hunter-gatherer origins, is that the alpha male winds up with most of the women. But the alpha strategy is not conducive to civilization. You need men that are somewhat compliant and submissive to a degree, that are willing to take orders from up top and take the orders down below. The alpha doesn't do any of that, and the alpha's strategy is, basically fuck as many women as possible and hope for the best. So fuck 100 women and maybe 10 of them will go on to have, produce a kid that's going to make it to the age of maturation to do the same fucking thing, to live another generation and follow the life script. But okay, that's a whole separate tangent, but I just couldn't believe that this guy posting this, knowing full well what a wasteful, grotesque, shitty game it is, where half the men are just getting thrown in the trash can. As it finds that acceptable as long as he can get his gratification. Fuck the rest. Fuck all the disposable carnage and bullshit. But yeah, so that I would say my point here is that anti-natalism is predominantly a male ideology with origins in early religious traditions that all had to do with male disposability. I am way more comfortable with being an anti-natalist as a man because most likely, historically speaking, my genes wouldn't have reproduced that much anyway. I've gotten lucky with women, I've gotten laid and stuff, but none of it lasted very long, and I do sincerely believe in some bygone historical era, say 100 or 200 years ago, that myself, among others, would have wound up in some sort of religious institution as a monk or a priest or something. I legitimately believe that. But as I've said before, the times make the man, not the other way around, and I am sort of left with, because our society is totally irrational and has no rational social engineering, I'm not in one of those institutions. Those institutions have broken down. But like I said, as a guy, I'm not invested in the human project at all. And again, men have to be domesticated to find that whole project interesting, like to find fatherhood compelling, to want to pay all these bills to produce some bratty kid that I get along okay with kids, but I don't really like them. Again, it's not my instinct to want to be a father. It's something that has to be inculcated in men. Like my father even had confessed to me on Father's Day. He was like, well, I never really wanted to be a dad that badly. It sort of just happened. We thought we were using protection, and your mother sort of just sprung it on me. And, he said in a sort of, I had to read between the lines, but that he sort of went on that it was kind of accidental, and he went along with it to make her happy, to stay in that relationship and get her approval and love and stuff. He was not totally invested in it, and he only had one kid, which again is kind of, revealing of that. But yeah, most men are like that. You see for historically that most father-sons relationships are shit, that fathers, again, it all has to be domesticated in them. So and that most of us are disposable. And again, it's just what a shit game. But yeah, there are female anti-natalists, and I've met and I've talked with some of them on the anti-natalist groups and stuff, but they're very abnormal, extremely abnormal in terms of their psychological profile. They're asexual, they're lesbian, they're maybe trans, or they got a lot of complicated issues, and it would be really rare. Typically, it would be mostly infertile women that would be one, because, there's a whole other aside here, but that the sex act is mainly, for men, is mainly a sexual, physiological gratification. We just want to get laid, predominantly. We're not really necessarily interested in all that other stuff unless we're given a script to follow that says we have to be interested in that stuff to get to the good stuff, so to speak. But women are innately programmed to want to have babies, for the most part. And they're the ones mainly responsible for it. But like I sort of went on with the school shooter thing, is that if you don't give men a good script to follow, we're just going to cause all sorts of problems. You want house cats, you got to